Our ancestors' diets were rich in the essential vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients needed for optimal function. But today, thanks to declining soil quality, a growing toxic burden, and other challenges in the modern world, most of us are not getting enough of these critical nutrients. That's why I created Adapt Naturals. It's a supplement line that closes the modern nutrient gap so you can feel and perform your best. Unlike most supplements that contain cheap synthetic compounds your body can't absorb, we use clinician grade, bioavailable ingredients that make a real and noticeable difference. I've translated 15 years of experience treating hundreds of patients and training over 3,000 healthcare providers into a supplement line you can trust. No BS or hype, just high quality, research backed, clinically validated products that get results. Our supplements are made without gluten or GMOs. They're also third party tested to validate ingredients and confirm they're free of heavy metals and other toxins. We have a full range of products, from the most advanced multivitamin and phytonutrient formula on the market to a blend of 8 organic superfood mushrooms, including reishi, chaga, and cordyceps, to a one-of-a-kind fish oil with bioavailable forms of curcumin and black seed oil. Our newest product is Luminous Mind, a blend of 7 nootropic compounds that boost cognitive function and elevate mood, including citicoline, UMP, bacopa, ginkgo, and lion's mane mushroom. These nootropic ingredients improve focus, memory, and attention, boost motivation and mood, and promote emotional and psychological resilience. They do this without the jitteriness, agitation, and sleep disturbances that often accompany caffeine. They also support brain health by protecting neurons, promoting neuroplasticity, and even regenerating new brain cells. Luminous Mind's a perfect fit for students, knowledge workers, entrepreneurs, creators, artists, people under mental or emotional stress, and those struggling with cognitive issues, low mood, and difficulty focusing and concentrating. I think of it as an unfair advantage that can help you achieve your goals, whatever they may be. Head to adaptnaturals.com to learn more and start living the life you want to live. Hey everyone, Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. I think it's fair to say we're living in pretty stressful times between the recent pandemic, the political discord, the growing polarization and divisiveness, multiple wars happening around the world, and just our increasing exposure to all of it through social media and the kind of 24/7 digital culture that we live in. We see rates of anxiety and depression skyrocketing and people just feeling like they're overwhelmed. So I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Greg Hammer as my guest. Dr. Hammer is a recent retired professor at Stanford University School of Medicine, pediatric intensive care physician, pediatric anesthesiologist, but more relevant to the conversation that we're going to be having today, a wellness and mindfulness lecturer and the author of Gain Without Pain, the Happiness Handbook for Healthcare Professionals. Now, this conversation we're having is not unique to healthcare professionals. That's just the context that Dr. Hammer has mostly applied his wellness and mindfulness work in. But we are going to talk about tools and approaches that everybody can use to find joy and peace in the midst of a really challenging set of circumstances. So we'll talk about how to overcome divisive thinking and polarization, how to build resilience, how to deal with uncertainty, the importance of cultivating non-judgmental awareness, the importance of acceptance and the difference between acceptance and approval and submission, the role that gratitude plays, and many other important topics that are really crucial. I mean, they're always crucial, but I would say they're even more crucial now than ever. I enjoyed this conversation. I think you're going to get a lot out of it. So without further delay, let's dive in. Dr. Greg Hammer, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
So times are challenging right now. It feels like living in a pressure cooker with the election coming up and just the increasing polarization and level of hostility in media and social media and just even in families and friends, relationships being torn apart by all of the recent events. And I know, several people in my family and my friend network are just expressing that they feel like they're kind of in a vice, and the vice is tightening more and more all the time. So this conversation is timely, and this is something I know you write and think a lot about. Let's start with how we can work with this increasing divisiveness and polarization that has really come to characterize the media and digital media environment that we live in.
Great question. First of all, I believe that the past 5 years or so have been perhaps more stressful than any other 5 year period within my lifetime, at least. The causes are well known to all of us, the COVID pandemic, which is still going on actually, but the repercussion. I'm finishing a book, by the way, on mindfulness for teenagers, and our teens are still suffering from the effects of COVID, not just physically, although they do have a percentage of those who are infected with the virus do have long COVID, just like adults, but emotionally, psychologically, because of the important developmental period in their lives that was changed so dramatically by the pandemic, where they were trying to learn remotely and were deprived of all the important social interactions that trigger their healthy social development, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we're all still functioning in the shadow of COVID. And in fact, there's still a lot of virus around. It keeps mutating. And I know that, for one, I had COVID about 2 months ago for the first time, was pretty sick for a couple weeks, and I'm still not back to normal. So that's a stress for everyone. I think many people lost loved ones under horrible circumstances during the peak of the COVID pandemic. People who were beloved, who were in their hospital rooms, isolated by themselves, etc. So that's one source of ongoing stress. And then, of course, the wars that are going on around the world, which seem to always be going on, but I think more recently the wars in Israel and Gaza, now in the north of Israel, and also in Ukraine, have certainly not only been sources of great stress, but polarization, particularly the Israel-Palestinian conflict, is a huge source of polarization within people in the United States. And then we have all of the continuous bad news about global warming and extremes of heat, which have caused has caused suffering for so many people around the world. Here in California, Northern California, where I live, we've been relatively spared, but we had temperatures over 100 degrees for many days in a row recently, which is very unusual. So I think the pandemic, political, military strife around the world, eco anxiety, among other things, have created just a tremendous amount of stress. And so that's our baseline. I think those stressors have us in a condition where many of us are kind of close to the edge of the cliff, even before we start incorporating the political divide. So I think that's the point of departure.
Right, and inflation, rising food prices, rising gas prices, people just generally feeling like they don't like they have the same jobs perhaps, but the money's not going as far as it used to, and they're not able to make ends meet, and that triggers a very primal reaction for most of us. It's because those are just basic survival needs, the ability to feed ourselves and our family, and to make a living, at the simplest level.
I couldn't agree more. And that dovetails with the political divide, because the reasons for the current inflation, how grocery prices have become so significantly increased, other issues related to our pocketbooks, are the source of great polarization amongst us. I think one political party or the other gets blamed for things that are really outside of their control, and so one side is defending and the other one is attacking. And so, yes, I think that we're all stressed out. I think what you mentioned is also a significant contributor. And then you get into the political divide. And I think we could talk about what I think some of the reasons why the added stress of the political divide, let's call it, is magnified in our current 24/7, 365 media news cycle. And I think that, unfortunately, apparently, bad news sells more than good news. And so we're bombarded constantly with all of the bad news about issues related to the pandemic, issues related to wars elsewhere, though those are truly horrific, and finances, global warming, and other aspects of politics are kind of pitched to us in very polarized and negative ways. You sort of pick your cable news station and you get a point of view that comports with what you want to hear, and that's a very dangerous situation where, in fact, artificial intelligence that's driving a lot of what gets pushed to individuals in the media is reinforcing our own set of beliefs. And so you have more and more polarization where each side is having its own point of view supported by the media they choose to, to which they choose to be exposed. So yes, I think these are all really important factors, and I'm glad we're having this conversation because it's really important to identify what the drivers are of our current situation of stress. And I think we've named a handful of very significant drivers, but until we really identify those, we can't embrace a strategy to ameliorate or improve the situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've talked on this show quite a bit about the role of digital technologies and algorithms on Meta and other platforms and how they have optimized for engagement in a way that has exacerbated the political divide and basically pushed people further and further to the polarities. Let's talk then. I mean, I think it is important that to identify all of these sources of stress, and of course, many people who are listening are probably nodding their heads and saying, "Yeah, I'm aware of why I'm stressed out. How do I deal with this?" So I want to start by talking about resilience. First defining it, how you think about resilience, and then we can talk a little bit about how to cultivate resilience. Because the reality is, for most of us, we have some control over some of these stressors, but me as an individual has a limited impact on climate change, I have a limited impact on the wars in the Middle East. I have a limited impact on a lot of on gas prices and food prices. So the reality is that those things are not in my control to change. What I do have some influence over is how I respond. And this is where resilience comes in.
Beautifully put. There's a formula in my first book, Gain Without Pain, that is suffering equals pain times resistance. The pain is there. The pain is knowing about these innocent people being killed, people starving, people in poverty, people who are sick with COVID, long COVID, et cetera. Those are examples of the pain. And the suffering is a matter of the magnitude of our suffering from that pain or from those painful stimuli, if you will, depends on how we manage our own physiology and mental and physical well being. And that is the resistance. Do we resist or do we accept? And so, just kind of taking a step back, my approach to dealing with stress is to have a mindfulness practice. And that, which I embrace and practice and teach, is called the GAIN practice. GAIN is in capital letters, an acronym for what I think are the four essential domains of stress reduction and happiness. And they are gratitude, acceptance, intention, and non judgment. So, with your permission, I can sort of walk through how those apply to the topic in question, which might be the political divide in the context of all these other stressors. So the G in GAIN is gratitude. I think, the next time we find that we're getting wound up because we're observing somebody expressing political points of view with which we disagree, or we're talking to a friend or Uncle Joe at the dinner table, and we're hearing views that we object to, and we're starting to get a stress response. That is, we can sense that the adrenaline in our body is increasing. We can't sense some of the other changes associated with acute stress, like the increase in cortisol, for example. But the net of those changes is generally, unless it's adaptive because we're running away from a predator or deciding to fight, those physiologic changes associated with stress are maladaptive because they evolved to help us flee from a predator or stay and fight, the so-called fight or flight response. But nowadays, stress is triggered mainly by our thoughts. We're not faced with an actual threat. We think about something that the other political party is espousing, and that elicits the stress response. So when we're having that stress response elicited in the context of a political discussion or being exposed to some media related to politics, the first thing that I would recommend is, first of all, go to your breathing. Make sure you're taking slow, deep, deliberate breaths, because that activates our parasympathetic nervous system and counteracts some of this fight or flight response. But think about that for which we're grateful. We have a highly functioning political system. And we tend to, according to our negativity bias, get overly wrapped up in all the negative aspects of our politics. But compared to other countries in the world, we're fortunate and can be appreciative that we have a functioning democracy. People's vote counts, and we have elected officials. We have the opportunity to express our views freely as long as we're not being violent about it. So let's be grateful for all of the attributes of our political system and the idea that we can even engage in this political discourse. So starting with the breath and then maybe going to our gratitude. Let's not forget about all of the positive things for which we have to be grateful. And we can go through the other elements and gain if you'd like.
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful. I definitely want to talk a little bit more about gratitude in general as we go through the podcast and some of the other elements of the acronym. But this, I think it'd be an instructive way of seeing how to apply it to a particular situation to just continue for now.
Yeah, well, the A in gain pertains to what you said a minute ago, which is that there's little that you can do about many of these things. So it pains you to be made excruciatingly aware of deaths in Gaza, for example, and in northern Israel, let's say. But there's not much you can do about it. So here's where the A in gain or acceptance is so critical to minimizing our suffering in response to that pain. And acceptance is really like gratitude, I think, embedded in all religious and philosophic tradition. And the Serenity Prayer, for example, which is, of course, one of the core values of Christianity, teaches us that we will hopefully be able to discern between things we can change and things that we cannot change, and have the wisdom and ability to learn to accept those things that cause us pain that we cannot change. So we have to decide, okay, do I want to engage in a protest related to what's happening in the Middle East, or donate money to the cause in Ukraine, or what have you? Or is this really something that is beyond my scope, and my energy and resources are better spent elsewhere? And once we make the decision through our discerning that it's something that we can't change, or the net is better if we attend elsewhere, then we can work on acceptance. And we do that through, I think, a practice. We have to be intentional about accepting, because our natural response to pain is to resist. And so we exacerbate our own suffering as our sort of default mode of thinking and being, just as though, or just as our default mode of thinking and being is to be rather negative. There's a lot of psychology and social science that tells us that we have a negativity bias. We tend to embrace the negative and push away or forget the positive. And so this is our default mode. So if we're going to think and be in ways other than this negative, resisting default mode, we have to have a plan. We have to have a purposeful approach. So first we identify what the issues are, as we've been discussing, identify the drivers, and then purposefully take aim at these and learn to rewire our brains in the way of favorable responses. And so, with regard to these painful issues we can't do anything about, acceptance is a practice. So I can tell you that in the gain meditation, which can be done in 3 or 4 minutes, preferably in the morning after we get up, open the blinds, and do our morning hygiene, we find a comfortable place to sit. We first focus on our breath, slowly inhaling through our nose, maybe to a count of 3, pausing to a count of 3, and then slowly exhaling to a count of 4, breathing into our belly, expanding our body, pausing, and then slowly exhaling. And that, again, will begin to calm us down, lower our heart rate and blood pressure and blood sugar, and activate our parasympathetic nervous system. And then we go through a self-guided tour of the gain elements, beginning with that for which we're grateful. So we identify things for which we are grateful, such as, our democracy. That can be a component of our morning gain meditation today or tomorrow. And then acceptance. So with regard to acceptance, a tool that I like to use and teach is, again, with our eyes closed, focus on the slow, deliberate breathing. We imagine something painful, the loss of a loved one. I lost my son 8 years ago at the age of 29. That pain is not going away. But through this practice, with my eyes closed, sitting comfortably, slowly, deeply, deliberately breathing, I imagine bringing that pain closer and closer, opening my chest, opening my heart, actually bringing the pain into my heart and residing with it, abiding there, and actually nurturing it and fully accepting it till when I ask myself the question, can I live with this pain forever? At some point, the answer will be yes. So we link this to our slow, deep breathing. And this is part of our gain practice, notably the exercise in learning acceptance, learning to be more adept at, more automatic at accepting painful thoughts and experiences that we cannot change.
Wonderful. I'd like to linger here for a little bit on this topic because I found that it's ripe for confusion sometimes. There's even just the word acceptance itself is pretty loaded and subject to different interpretations. So I like to differentiate between acceptance and submission, which, sometimes when I have this conversation with people about acceptance, the response is, I can't possibly accept what's happening in Gaza, for example, in the Middle East. I can't accept that people are dying in these wars. Why should I accept that that's happening? And of course, acceptance is just the recognition that it is happening in this moment. It's not a stamp of approval. It's not agreeing to never try to do anything about it, to make any changes, to be active in making that change. But I think it can be tricky there. So I'm curious how you think about that and talk about that with folks, because in my experience, that gap in understanding can be an obstacle for people when we talk about acceptance.
I think you nailed it, actually. You have to go through that thought process and if you will, take a logical approach to it. So let's just go downstream with this notion of I cannot accept this. So what does that actually mean? I cannot accept what's happening in the Middle East, notably in Israel and the Palestinian lands. Okay, I can't accept that. So what are my alternatives? My alternatives are either just simplifying and taking a logical approach. I can either try to do something about it, or since I can't really do anything about it, if that is my conclusion, I'm just going to resist this whole process. The opposite of acceptance in this context is resistance. So if we want to be mathematical, acceptance equals 1 over resistance, or is proportional to 1 over resistance. So the suffering equals pain times resistance becomes suffering equals pain divided by acceptance. So if the acceptance is big, then the in the denominator, then suffering is reduced. So what are my options? So my options are to actually get up and do something about it. Maybe I can march. Maybe I can try to donate money to whichever cause is, I think appropriate. But absent the ability to do something about it, my only other option is to resist, is to agonize over it, is to get into arguments about it, is to magnify my suffering because I just don't accept it. So there you go. What I'm doing as an alternative to acting toward a solution is I'm simply magnifying my own suffering. That's really the end point of this process of I cannot accept it. I can't do anything about it and I can't accept it. So what I'm actually doing is just magnifying my own suffering. I think you really have to look at it in that way. It's a very simple but logical approach. And I think one has to be circumspect about how we engage with others in presenting that point of view. But I think that's basically, the bottom line here.
Right. And it's worth pointing out in that situation that resisting and not accepting didn't do anything to change the situation itself. All it did was add more suffering, namely your own suffering and possibly suffering of others if you're externalizing and projecting that resistance outward in the form of unpleasant or hostile attacks against other people who don't share your views, which of course we do see happening all the time, every day, all day long on all of the social media platforms and in other forums as well.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I think basically what we're talking about in part is our negativity bias. We often choose to be negative. So given the choice of being negative or being pragmatic, we often choose the negative option that leads to an increase in our suffering. So the reason that I can't accept what's happening in the Middle East is because I love people, and it's a hugely painful experience that people are suffering, people are being killed, etc. So it's because I love my brothers and sisters on the planet that this is so painful to me. So am I going to get into arguments with myself and manifest resistance and get into arguments with other people, some of whom I love especially, and alienate them because I'm so vehement in my opinions? All I'm doing is magnifying the suffering, as you said, and creating a negative situation and actually decreasing my ability to express my love for my friends and family and decreasing their ability to express it to me because I'm not receiving it, because I'm resisting their points of view if they're different than mine. So you get into this whole realm of negativity, and that's a choice. And, we're not going to only focus on gratitude and pretend that, everything is a bowl of cherries, because it's not. That's why the second letter in GAIN in the acronym is acceptance. We have to acknowledge that there's pain in the world, that there's loss, that there's uncertainty, that there's insecurity, that there's all the other things that contribute to our pain. And we're going to actually take that on. We're going to have a plan to be able to cope with the pain in life. It's intrinsic to life itself.
Let's talk about that a little more, because something else you said earlier when you were talking about acceptance is related to that, which is when we accept, we open to the pain. And I think it's often the case that when we resist, it's because we don't want to feel the pain, the feelings that will inevitably come when we accept whatever it is that we're faced with. And sometimes those, I think that fear is, it's a basic human response because we're afraid of being so overwhelmed by the enormity of the pain, especially like with the death of a loved one, somebody very close to us, or something that's deeply meaningful to us. We fear that if we accept and open to that pain, then we'll never come out of it. And so there's that wall and the resistance that goes up. So before we move on to I and intention, maybe we can talk a little bit about practicing with pain and how to navigate that when it feels like the pain can be just potentially overwhelming or shattering.
Sure. I think that's a really such a key and important point. I'll tell you a little bit about my own story as it pertains to that. When uh, when I was a university student, I was very interested in astronomy, but I also got very interested in nutritional science and human biology. Decided to go to medical school, and as a medical student, we do these rotations through all the different specialties. I found that when I was on my pediatrics rotation, I felt more kinship to the other people practicing medicine, nursing, respiratory therapy, et cetera, in the pediatric domain. They sort of didn't take themselves too seriously. They didn't have so much ego as I found in some of the adult medicine areas and surgery. So I decided to go into pediatrics, which I did. When I was a pediatric resident, I did my first rotation in the intensive care unit and I loved it. And I realized that I was not going to be having an office practice and, seeing 20, 30 patients a day, that I wanted to really take care of the sickest of the sick. And so at that time, anesthesiology and critical care and pediatrics were a good combination and still are, but less commonly now. So I decided to do a residency in anesthesiology and then fellowships in pediatric anesthesiology and intensive care. And again, this is something I was passionate about. I love the specialties. And I knew I would be taking care of a lot of very critically ill infants and children, many of whom would die in my care. So I knew I would be dealing with a lot of death and dying. And so somebody told me, don't get too close to your patients because when they have a bad outcome, when they die, your heart will be broken. And that just did not resonate with me. To me, I want to be close to my patients and their families. I mean, that to me is part of the joy of being a provider in this area. And so I realized if I'm going to be able to cope with death and dying in my patients and the repercussions in their family, I better really think about this and open my heart to it and dwell in that domain of death and dying, come to an understanding about our mortality, including my own in the process, and learn to really be accepting. And it was a process. And there's no destination. I don't fully accept or, reside happily in the knowledge of my own death or the death of others that I care about. But I've certainly made a lot of progress, and that's through an intentional practice of bringing the pain in, really learning how to open my heart to the pain. And I found that progressively during my career, I'm able to sit with these families, and sometimes they have all the medical science information they need. And the thing that I can do for them the most is actually just to be fully present with them, fully mindful, if you will, being fully aware of the present moment is part of mindfulness, and listen to them without having a response formulated, without having an agenda of what I want to tell them, but just at some point, at some stage in this process of taking care of a family with a child who's in the process of dying or just very, very critically ill, listening, residing, abiding. And that involves opening my heart to the pain, being fully exposed. And I found that this is one of the most rewarding components of my practice over the last 35 years. It has been. And I'm so grateful for the fact that I had the opportunity to serve in this way and that I had the wherewithal to really embark on this journey. And so that's an example of what you just, you know, importantly pointed out that it's not something that's our default mode to be able to sit in that room and be mindful and listen and to be able to stay in the room. It's uncomfortable. It's a potentially very uncomfortable situation where I have really nothing more to offer other than my own presence and listening. That can be just a very uncomfortable situation. But if we take an approach of acceptance, it can also be a very rewarding circumstance.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'm so excited to announce the latest product I formulated for my supplement line, Adapt Naturals. Luminous Mind is a blend of 7 nootropic compounds that boost cognitive function and elevate mood, including phosphatidylserine, bacopa, ginkgo, lion's mane, and more. Nootropics are substances that improve focus, memory, and attention, boost motivation and mood, and promote emotional and psychological resilience. They also support brain health by protecting neurons, promoting neuroplasticity, and even regenerating new brain cells. I spent over 2 years researching, developing, and testing this product. One of our early testers described the experience of taking it as turning the lights back on. She felt clear headed, focused, and alert, yet calm and grounded without the jitteriness or crashes of caffeine. She also said her mood was brighter and she felt uplifted and enlivened. This was the inspiration for calling it Luminous Mind. I designed the supplement for anyone who wants to boost their cognitive function, creativity, and mood, and support and protect their brain health. It's a perfect fit for students, knowledge workers, entrepreneurs, creators, artists, people under mental or emotional stress, and those struggling with cognitive issues, low mood, and difficulty focusing and concentrating. Think of it as an unfair advantage that can help you achieve your goals, whatever they may be. Visit adaptnaturals.com to learn more about Luminous Mind and place your first order. So let's talk about intention, the next letter in the acronym. And you're welcome to relate that to the political climate we've been talking about, or just over, how it shows up overall in this process of building resilience, dealing with uncertainty, and finding some joy and peace in the midst of incredible suffering and difficulty.
Our default way of being, as I think we've discussed a little bit, is to be rather negative and also to be very distracted. It's very hard for us to dwell in the present moment. So I love Dr. John Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness, which could be, I think, the definition of happiness, which is all that about 8 billion of us want, is to be happy. And that definition was being aware of the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. So there are the gain elements of on purpose or intention, and the end and gain being non-judgment, which we can get to. But the reason that he said being aware of the present moment is because that's where happiness lives. Yes, we can have happy memories and thinking of the past, and yes, it's adaptive also sometimes to think about the future, to plan happy times. But I think for most of us, if not all of us, the most profound times of happiness are when we are fully present. So I'm walking through the forest, I'm appreciating the footfall on the soft forest floor covered with pine needles. I'm smelling that pine. I'm sort of enjoying the oxygen enriched environment produced by all of the plant life. And I'm seeing the sunlight filtering through the canopy 100 feet above. And I'm just totally present and I'm happy and I'm at peace. And I often feel under those circumstances, if I die right now, I'm okay with it. Just bury me out here or cast my ashes out here because I'm present. And so I'm happy. And I think we get that same thing from listening to a beautiful piece of music. We're sort of fully present, or making love with a partner. There's the moments of really being purely present and sort of feeling blissful. So happiness is in the present, yet our brains, our default mode is to be very distracted. If we close our eyes and just try to pay attention to what's going on right now, whether it's the pressure of the chair against our body or the tingling of the soles of our feet or hearing a car or an airplane go by in the distance, our minds will very quickly start focusing on what we have to do when we're done doing this, or perhaps tomorrow, or the list of things that we have to get home to do, or our brains will go to something we said or didn't say yesterday that we're embarrassed about. So it's very hard for us to stay present, but that's where happiness lives for the most part. So if we want to be present, and if we want to be more positive and pragmatic, it's not our default mode. So that means we have to do something other than just sink into our default mode. And that means we have to have a plan. So as you and I have discussed, we have to identify what the drivers are of our current state of some unhappiness. And then we have to have a plan as to what to do about it. And here's where the I in intention really comes into focus. I think that the first thing that we can do is rewire our brains. And fortunately, our brains, though we're wired to be negative and distracted, we also are wired to be have this wonderful quality called neuroplasticity. We can actually change the way we think. And so how do we do that? We're here in our gain meditation. We're breathing slowly and deeply. We've slowed our heart rate and lowered our blood pressure. We've gone through a tour of that for which we're grateful, something painful that we're learning to accept. We get to the I. While we're breathing slowly and deeply and deliberately, focus on our present experience. At first, maybe we can only be there for 5 seconds. The pressure of the chair against our body, the tingling of the soles of our feet, the sound of a bird or a dog barking next door or a car going by in the distance. And let's just breathe in and abide in that present experience. And maybe it's 5 seconds today, maybe it's 10 seconds next week, maybe it's 30 seconds a month from now. So that's part of our intention, is to learn to be more present. When we identify with that light bulb moment that we're agonizing over something that hasn't happened yet, we're thinking about tomorrow, and with our negativity bias, we're thinking about something negative tomorrow. We're catastrophizing, we're generating a lot of fear and anxiety. A light bulb goes off, and we just use these tools to bring ourselves back into our present experience and drop the anxiety about what hasn't even happened yet. So we're exercising our brains, we're rewiring our brains to be more present. And that is through this intentional practice. And then, we may transition to thoughts of what are my other intentions to be more generous, more loving, more kind, more patient, more grateful, more accepting, more non-judgmental. Again, we're linking this to the slow, deep breathing during this phase of what can be a very brief practice.
Yeah, so important and increasingly difficult in the modern world that we live in, where there are now, we're connected, many of us, to screens through much of the day. And there are, these are the companies who manufacture these technologies are incentivized to reap as much of our attention as they can, because that's the medium that they sell advertising against. We're the product, as Tristan Harris pointed out in The Social Dilemma. And so if you just go with the flow these days, then your attention will, by definition, be scattered, because, let's say you have 40, 50 apps on your phone and they all have notifications, and you haven't turned any of those notifications off. Just the notifications of those apps all day long, beeping and flashing, are going to be enough to distract you, completely from whatever's happening in the present moment. And so I love the I in intention, because the only way now to have moments of solitude and moments of present moment awareness is intention. If you don't have that intention, you will not just stumble upon that, unless there's a EMP, or like the cell networks are down, and all of a sudden none of those devices work, which I think intention is powerful there. We do, for example, a multi-day river trip, rafting trip with our family every summer. And one of the reasons we like to do that is because nothing works. None of the digital devices work, and you are completely off the grid with other people who are also off the grid. It's one of the few environments I know of now where you can do that and just have a week of time with nobody on a screen, nobody checking their email, nobody responding to text messages, etc. But for me, it's really important just to recognize that we are in a battle for our own attention, and there are forces that are trying actively to secure our attention. And so we all have to be very intentional about our attention, and very, I would say, even guarded about where we spend our attention, because it's our most precious resource. And if we don't have our attention, there's no hope of us dwelling in the present moment.
Absolutely. And our life is really just a series of present moments. And we will miss our own life if we are constantly attending to the future and the past. And again, I consider what is adaptive and what is maladaptive. And it's adaptive to reflect on happy times, think of the past in that regard, or to learn from our mistakes. So sometimes we do have to identify mistakes that we've made that cause us pain and cause us suffering. And we have to learn how to accept those. And it's adaptive with regard to the future, to plan, to put bread on the table and plan events with friends and family. But beyond that, our default mode is to ruminate over the past, to overthink the past and overthink the future. And when you blend that with our negativity bias, you get overthinking the past results in depression, shame, regret, imposter syndrome. And with regard to overthinking the future and our negativity bias, we generate a lot of fear and anxiety. So you're absolutely right. With regard to all the forces that are tending to knock us off being aware of the present moment, sort of knock us off that perch, if you will. But the good news is we can actually do something about that. And it's not fundamentally that difficult to limit our screen time, limit our social media exposure. It's simple. Now that you go on this river trip repeatedly, you've got it down. You just sort of turn things off and go. It's not that hard, really. But it's not our default mode. Our default mode is to kind of get sucked into this. And I think, our default mode is to allow ourselves to be distracted to a significant degree, because then we don't have to think about some of the pain in our lives, for example, and some of the fear, anxiety, and depression that we suffer from. So, the bottom line is it's not that complicated. It's not that difficult. We just have to decide it's important and make a plan, focus our intention.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's intention can go a long way, and and practice as well. Like you mentioned, neuroplasticity, neurons that fire together wire together, right? And so the downside of that is if we're accustomed to a very distracted frame of mind, those circuits have been reinforced. The positive side of that, is, as you pointed out, is that that's not permanent. There's nothing inherently permanent about that, and we can train our minds to be more focused and less distractible. And I think this is where acceptance and compassion come in as well toward ourselves. Like if you have been in a situation, like in a place of a lot of distraction and lack of attention, it's not going to be an overnight process to reverse that. And so just extending as much compassion to yourself in that process of change and transformation is probably going to help you along the way, rather than a lot of self-judgment, which is a good segue into the N, which is non-judgment, and really kind of required for, in some way, I think, if you can think about it, for all of the others letters, all of the letters kind of interact and it seems to me in a really important and meaningful ways and myriad ways. But non-judgmental awareness is kind of the ground of all of it.
I think you're right. The gain elements, and I've thought a lot about this, and the gain elements are very closely interrelated. You can't really talk about one without talking about the other ones. So what you said about using our intention to be more accepting, more grateful, more non-judgmental, again, they're all interrelated. And I just want to amplify that we are all wired this way. This is the way our brains are wired. And this evolution of the way our brains are wired happened over tens, hundreds of thousands of years. So yes, we're not going to change the way our brains are wired overnight. But the good news is, through relatively simple practice, if we have enough intention, we can begin to rewire our brains so that we are more at peace and happier starting today. So we're not going to totally flip things 180, but we can begin to right the ship and begin to point ourselves in the right direction. It's not that complicated. So yes, the end and gain is as crucial as the other three elements. And our brains are not only wired to be negative, but they're wired to be very judgmental. So we're always assessing the world around us, other people, and ourselves. And unfortunately, with our negativity bias, these assessments or judgments tend to be negative. So we tend to be negative about the way we look at the world, the way we judge other people, and then most harshly, ourselves. We are certainly our own most harsh critics. And there's a lot of psychology science, social science to support that. And so it's really imperative that we embrace tools to learn how to drop the judging. And the good news is we have that capability.
So, in this environment that we're living in, judgment is, maybe amplified, certainly more than I've ever seen it in my lifetime. And I mean, in some ways, by definition, that's what's happening with the increasing divisiveness and polarization and the dehumanizing of the other side, I would say, is something that has reached new levels in my lifetime. I remember growing up, my parents had lots of friends who differed politically from them, but they could get together and play volleyball at the beach or, hang out together. And they were great friends and they still had a good time together. These days, it seems like that's increasingly less likely. And so I wonder about like the difference between judgment and discernment. We talked a little bit about the trap of confusing acceptance with approval or acceptance with submission. I think sometimes when we talk about non-judgment, that can be confused with a sort of like a state of just having no opinions, having no discernment, no ability to, identify right or wrong or make informed choices or things like that. So how do you think about non-judgment in this context?
Great question. It's important to underscore the difference between discernment and judgment. And I'll give you an example that might highlight the difference. I have two friends, John and Mary. John is very pragmatic, forward looking, optimistic. He's kind of like me, and I really enjoy John's company. Mary is somebody that I've known since I was a child. I'm close to Mary. I value her friendship, but she's kind of a downer. She tends to complain. She tends to be a bit ungrateful and resisting and judgmental of others. So I have an hour to have a cup of coffee with one of my friends. I'm considering either getting together with John or getting together with Mary. And I'm going to choose John. I'm going to discern that that hour is going to be better spent, in my view, getting together with a guy after which I'm going to be uplifted. And, it's going to be a really deep connection. It's going to be great. With Mary, on the other hand, I'll probably end up being, a little neutral or maybe even a little bit down from our time together. But so I'm discerning that I'd rather spend the time with John, but I don't have to judge either person. It doesn't mean that John is good and Mary is bad. They are both human beings. They are both, like me, simply the person that they are. They are neither good nor bad. They're both, I would introduce the concept of benevolent indifference. I feel benevolent toward both of them, but in some way indifferent as to their goodness or badness. And so this is, I think, a model for how to approach one's view, because when we judge, we are employing our own set of biases, and we're really looking at the world and others and ourselves through sort of a tinted glasses, if you will, right? Because if we just look at the way things are, there is no judgment necessary or appropriate. So back to the gain meditation, we've really sunken into this slow, deep, deliberate breathing. We've gone through that for which we're grateful. We've brought a painful thought or experience into our heart and reinforced the idea of living with it, accepting it. We have underscored our intention to be focused on the present moment and also to be kinder, gentler, more loving, generous human beings. And all this is linked to our deep breathing. We get to the end in non-judgment, and there are some tools that we can use to rewire our brains or begin to do so to let go of judgment. So one might be picture an image of the Earth apparently suspended in space, one of these gorgeous NASA images. So as we're breathing slowly, deeply, deliberately, we're imagining with our eyes closed this image of the Earth, and it's a lovely planet, but it's neither good nor bad. The Earth doesn't possess qualities of goodness or badness. And this seems fairly clear to us as we take these slow, deep, deliberate breaths. We sort of sit and abide with this idea that the Earth is lovely, but neither good nor bad. And it occurs to us then that we too are just human beings. Just the Earth is the Earth. I am a human being. I'm neither good nor bad. I don't inherently possess qualities of goodness or badness. I'm just the person that I am. And we link this to our slow, deep breathing. I simply am the person I am. I'm neither good nor bad. And we reside in this awareness for 30 seconds while we're breathing in this way. And then we return our focus just to our breath. And then we slowly open our eyes, and we've completed this 3 to 5 minute practice. And it leaves us with this sense that, yes, I don't have to judge things. I can discern, I can decide how I want to spend my time, but I don't have to convey this property of goodness, badness, too big, too small, etc. I can just observe things the way they are. And eventually we can learn to view ourselves in the same way. And that really is so key to happiness.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And that's a good note to wrap up on. Dr. Hammer, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people learn more about your work and check out your book?
Well, first, it's great to be with you, Chris. And my website is greghammermd.com, GREGHAMMERMD.com. There's a lot of media and other information there and a link to the book, Gain Without Pain. And yeah, it's been a great pleasure being with you. And I'm grateful to you and your listeners.
Likewise. And thanks, listeners, for tuning in. Keep sending your questions to chriskresser.com/podcast question. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.